Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to be talking about the putting together competitive proposals for the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's National Coastal Resilience Fund. This is an opportunity to get some info, but more importantly, probably ask any questions that you guys have. So I'll kick things off here. I think I know most everybody who's on the call with us today, but I'm Amy Holtzhaus. I'm the Director of Conservation for the Nature Conservancy in Ohio. And I've been with TNC for coming up on 8 years, but have also done lots of work in watershed management here for the last 20 years of my career. So good to see some familiar names and some names that are a little bit of a blast from the past. So always fun to see that too. So thanks for joining us today. Today we're co-hosting this with Throwe Environmental, and I've got 3 partners from that group that are with us today. So Taylor is going to help us keep all things running and organized today. And so if you're having any technical difficulties, let Taylor know. And Taylor's the business operations consultant and the lead for Throwe Environmental's work as a field liaison for both the National Coastal Resilience Fund and also the Long Island Sound Futures Fund. We're also joined with Dan Nees. Dan is a project partner at Throwe Environmental and a senior fellow with the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland. Prior to his time with the Center for Global Sustainability, Dan was the director of the university's Environmental Finance Center. And he has over 20 years assisting communities in their efforts to finance environmental and sustainable development initiatives. And last but not least on our team today is Kyle Gray. Kyle is also a project partner with Throwe Environmental, and he leads the company's technical assistance work with the Southeast New England Program Network and supports Throwe's work as a field liaison for the National Coastal Resilience Fund and also the Long Island Sound Futures Fund. So thanks again for joining us all today, and we're hope we can move through presentation here about 20 minutes. We've got we are recording this, so hopefully everybody's all right with that. And if you have any questions as we're going through things, feel free to put questions in the Q&A, and we will get to those after a brief presentation here. So primarily today we're looking at just a program overview and looking at the National Coastal Resilience Fund and really looking at what are those opportunities, priority categories, and some of the funding basics for this particular program. And I think from there, I'm kicking it over to Dan.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everybody, for the opportunity to be with you today. And I'm going to just kind of go through the program itself, provide some of the highlights about what it supports and what it does, some of the changes that have occurred over the last year or so. And then Kyle is going to jump in and get into some of the specifics about what makes for a competitive proposal. I know most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and many of you may even be familiar with the National Coastal Resilience Fund. So our goal here is to kind of give you as much new information as possible and answer any questions you may have, and hopefully from this conversation elicit some quality proposals coming out of the Great Lakes region generally, and the state of Ohio more specifically. You can go to the next slide, Kyle. So the Throwe Environmental is a consultancy that is located in Bristol, Rhode Island. We've been contracted by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to be a field liaison for the National Coastal Resilience Fund. Our work consists of 3 primary activities. We provide some support to existing grantees and technical assistance through check-ins and troubleshooting, things like that, and also some follow-up and additional technical assistance to proposals that may not have been successful in previous rounds of the funding cycle. But mostly what have been doing with NFWF, and certainly the focus of our work today, is on promoting the fund itself and the climate resilience programs that it supports. And so that's the purpose of today's conversation. So our goal is to basically get as many quality communities and projects through the door and hopefully funded as we possibly can. Next slide. So just a little bit of background. NCRF was established by NFWF in 2018. It has been primarily a federal program, but not exclusively. So as you can see on the right there in 2021, there were 8 partners, some of them federal, but also some private institutions that were funding the program up until 2021, or I should say 2022 through 2021. Again, it was mostly federal, and the federal funding was about 30 million, and then some additional funding of about 10 million or so coming from these other institutions. That changed dramatically with the passage of the infrastructure bill. And so in 2022, the fund is now up to $140 million annually. So there will be a significant increase, obviously, in the amount of money that is flowing through this fund. And so that is going to have obviously some significant ramifications on how the program is administered and the types of resources and programs that come through the door. Next slide. So the purpose of the fund is primarily, is twofold, and this is really important. And this is one of the main issues that come up with this fund and how it can impact and benefit communities. The first is it is meant to support communities in their efforts to become more resilient using nature-based systems, and it's primarily focused on the hazards associated with climate change. As you can see here, sea level rise, flooding, those types of things. Again, this is a coastal resilience program, and in a minute we'll talk about where the priority areas are. And so naturally the hazards and the resilience issues that it focuses on are coastal related and primarily water related. In addition, this is the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and so those projects and those resources that the fund is supporting need to also be supporting fish and wildlife issues, including habitat. So it's the combination of those two things that makes this fund unique and really gets at its primary purpose. Next. And so the focus is, again, coastal. Now we get a lot of questions from the Great Lakes, and people are like, why are we focusing on the Great Lakes if this is a coastal fund? Well, because it includes all of the coastal areas of the Great Lakes. And so the fund focuses on Huck A watersheds that drain to the ocean or the Great Lakes, as well as adjacent low-lying hucks that are tidally influenced. So that's, as you can see in the orange in Ohio, that is the areas of focus. If there are projects that are outside that area, they will not be considered. They have to be inside that area. For those of you that have investigated this fund and have been on the website, you probably have seen reference to resilience hubs, and that is a planning tool that is provided looks at where there are opportunities to have significant impact. So again, it's a planning tool that it was within the area of influence, which is the coastal area. So it's really the orange area is the primary area. You must be inside that area, and then the resilience hubs are an opportunity to find out where your project can have the greatest influence. Next slide. And so what is eligible? So it'd be easiest to get at this issue by talking about what's not eligible. So obviously federal agencies and employees of federal agencies are not eligible. Foreign organizations are not, as well as foreign public institutions and unincorporated individuals. And so pretty much anything else is eligible. So this is a really good opportunity for many different institutions. So public, private, nonprofit. There are some restrictions on semi-federal organizations, so things like Sea Grant and things like that. They can comply or be considered for funding, but there's some issues associated with match and things like that. So it's really important to check with NFWF if you're coming from one of these semi-federal organizations about what is possible and what is not. And the same is true for for-profit. There are just restrictions on how for-profit institutions can be funded, but for the most part, organizations that are putting projects on the ground are eligible for funding. And so it really is an open opportunity for quite a few organizations. Next slide. So those are the things that have to happen. You got to be in a coastal community. You got to be within that coastal area. You got to be focusing on both resilience and on habitat. And then the other things that absolutely have to happen are these three things. The first is it must be investing in nature-based solutions. So again, it's kind of reiterating the point that I made before, but it's really important that this is a nature-based project. So there's a lot of really important resilience work that needs to be done in communities that is focused on, for lack of a better term, gray infrastructure. So things like seawalls and those types of things. And while that is extremely important, it is not appropriate for this particular funding opportunity. This is nature-based. The second is there have to be clear benefits to community resilience. So on the other side of what I just talked about, you could have a habitat restoration project that's really important from a habitat perspective. But if it's not within an area that's going to have a real impact on community, then it's probably not going to be looked at as strongly. So those two things have to be coupled together. It's got to benefit nature and it's got to benefit the community. And then again, it has to have those clear fish, wildlife, and habitat benefits. So that's the sweet spot that this program is looking to hit. And again, it has to be within the coastal areas. Next slide. So that's really, those are the things that that's kind of the bar that you have to reach in order to be considered for funding. But then there's some other areas that will make projects more competitive and that we're really looking for and that NFWF is really looking for. The first is there has to be meaningful community and partner engagement. So in this, another way of putting this is it has to be part of a broader community or planning effort. This needs to be something that has been demonstrated that the community needs and wants and is planned for, and that you have the partners that are engaged, that represent the community. And so that community involvement is very important. The second is it has to be scaled, the project itself, scaled to address the problem, and that can be either direction. Large scale projects that are going to be addressing a pretty minimal resilience issue or concern is probably going to get flagged. But more so the other direction, which is you may have a very small scale project, but it's addressing a really big issue. And unless you can talk about how that smaller project is fitting into a broader planning and implementation process down the line, it's probably going to have a problem getting considered competitively. So the project, again, has to be addressed in link and sync with the scale of the problem. They're definitely like to see innovative techniques and piloting of techniques. Again, keeping in mind, innovation here is nature-based primarily. So this is not grayscale or gray infrastructure type innovation, but more innovation in nature-based systems that can be tested for resilience, community resilience. Transferability to other communities or regions is really important. And that connection, that transferability can be a direct connection in link, or it could be more indirect. So a direct connection could be, as I mentioned before, as part of a broader planning initiative. And there are plans to bring in other communities as part of a broader ecosystem restoration effort. Or it can be less direct than that and basically provide some understanding of how other communities that are in similar positions, though maybe in other regions, could possibly benefit from the techniques and the ideas that are put in place. So transferability and innovation are really important. And finally, but certainly not meant to be less important than the others, is to benefit underserved communities. This is especially an issue and a point of emphasis for NFWF in the Great Lakes region and even in Ohio. So the idea is to impact those communities that have been disenfranchised and left out of much of the implementation and certainly financing conversation as it relates to resilience infrastructure in the past. That can be urban communities, it can be communities of color, it can even be rural communities that have just somehow been left out. But the issue here is that want to make sure that these resources are going to those places where it's needed the most, as it relates to community benefit. Next slide. And I'm not sure if this is my slide, Kyle, or your slide. So
yep, this is where I take over.
Yeah,
so
okay.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dan. That was a great overview of this program at large, what it focuses on, the absolute must for a proposal, and then some other areas that folks should consider in order to be more competitive. From here on out, though, we want to dive a little bit deeper into the priority categories for this funding program. So you'll see there are 4 on screen. The first is a planning level grant, and that's community capacity building and planning. And then those last 3 are all project level. So you've got 2 design or site assessment categories, And then the final fourth one is all about putting projects on the ground. So that's, actual restoration and then monitoring thereafter. So it's really important to be familiar with what these four categories are, because NFWF encourages and requires everyone to pick only one priority category when you're applying. So you're not, we're not thinking about design builds here. We're not going from the planning stage all the way to implementation. You should be picking one of these categories based on whatever your desired outcome for the project is. So then the reason for having all four of these and, making sure we talk about them is so folks are aware of this pipeline, right? And NFWF does this on purpose. They established this idea of a funding pipeline. So if you apply in year one of a project, and then maybe you come back 4 years later and you're ready to apply for final design, there's kind of a natural sequence in how you might go about doing that. Or if you don't get funded, but then you come back a few years later, you have an idea of where your project would fit into this pipeline. So it's definitely encouraged to keep you thinking and to keep moving projects forward. But can't underscore that point enough. You really only want to pick one of these categories when moving forward with the proposal. So we can go into each of these individually, starting with the first one, that planning level community capacity building category. So projects here tend to be around 2 years in length, but that's just on average. They of course understand, based on the size of a project or the scale that it's working at, there's some flexibility here. What Dan mentioned kind of on one of his first slides is really important here, and that's that infrastructure bill funding. So, the average award amounts for all four of these categories has, now gone up. We estimate that they will be higher this year because of all that federal funding coming down the pike. So for 2022, NFWF estimates around $300,000 to $350,000 per award on average in this funding category. Now, again, that's flexible based on project size, the number of partners you're working with, the scale that you're working at, all of that. But this is kind of a ballpark estimated average. Now, again, we're picking categories based on the outcome that you're working towards. So the outcome here in this first priority area would be a plan. So some type of planning document or planning exercise that lays out prioritized nature-based strategies and projects on the ground. So if you're working in a community that doesn't have a resilience plan, this might be a good way to conduct that capacity building, to go through those planning exercises, and to put together, a resource that has different nature-based options to move forward with in working towards implementing a project. Some other key things to consider with this priority area is that stakeholder engagement is of critical importance for this one. So we're constantly talking about capacity building, bringing in different voices, bringing in various stakeholders, outside partners, all to work towards planning those resilience projects that will, of course, include nature-based solutions and features. A couple other things to note here is that there is no cap or a maximum on what you can request for funding for any of these four categories. So those averages are just that they're, what NFWF expects to see, but there is no maximum that you can request. And then last, just on this priority area is that this category is a little bit newer for the program as a whole. So a couple of years back, this one did not exist, or maybe it was formed a little bit differently. And the reason for it now being the first, introductory, step for folks to get into the program is because of its flexibility. So it really works to enhance capacity building. And NFWF knows that that can take a lot of different forms in a lot of different communities. So this one really works to get folks into the pipeline, to help you identify your needs, and to figure out what potential project solutions might be. And there's some wiggle room there to do so in a way that, of course, fits within the program and benefits your community. So the next category is our first, site assessment and design area. So, projects here should reach a preliminary design, and that's what we consider 30 to 60% design. Another way to think about that outcome is this step should bring you to a point where you can make a go or no go decision on a project. At this point, you should be able to identify appropriate sites for a project and decide whether or not that initiative moves forward. All that being said, there's still no maximum award here, but it's estimated that average awards will be anywhere between $250,000 to $500,000, and projects here tend to last about a year. Now thinking about that pipeline again, projects in this phase should have been identified in a previous planning effort. So if you are following this pipeline, maybe that was done in the first round of funding if you had been accepted for that. If you hadn't applied, or maybe you didn't get accepted for that first round of funding, another plan or another initiative that's been done in your community or at a regional level, that plan should have identified projects that would move forward in order to support resilience in fish and wildlife habitat. So this one's really focused on specific project assessments, moving preliminary permitting conversations forward on a specific project. And there's also some room here to start incorporating baseline monitoring. The next phase will move us towards final design and permitting. So moving projects from the 30 to 60% area all the way to 90 or 100% design. Permitting conversations should be well underway here, moving projects towards that restoration ready implementation. Projects tend to be 1.5 years for this priority area, and the average award amount goes from $500,000 to $750,000. And again, that's estimated. There's no maximum amount required. And then the last phase, the restoration and monitoring, this is where all the exciting stuff happens. This is, getting projects on the ground. This is where projects tend to take the longest and get the most funding, because this is our implementation category. So projects here tend to last, less than 3 years. And they also include 1 year of additional monitoring. With all this new funding coming from the infrastructure bill, it's estimated that these will range between $5 million to $10 million for each project. And the idea here is to start moving projects, forward that are really working at scale, right? So thinking about larger scale projects in this restoration and monitoring category will definitely be of benefit. Just thinking about how to move that infrastructure bill funding, out the door and into communities. The outcome we're working towards, of course, is implementation, but also that, monitoring thereafter. So working, with the community and with NFWF to have a clear understanding of what that monitoring consists of and how, that data will make its way back. So those are the 4 areas that, you really have to have a good sense of and, figure out how you'd like to apply when looking at this program. And with all that in mind, we thought it would be helpful to include a couple of examples of projects that have gone through this process and that have been funded. So the first one comes right from Ohio. We've got the Cleveland Harbor Eastern Embayment Resilience Study, or CHEERS. This was a project that was awarded to Cleveland Metro Parks 2 times in the NCRF. So most recently, this came in the 2021 grant cycle, and it was successfully funded. But prior to that, it entered in 2019 under the preliminary design category. So a couple of years ago, this came in under preliminary design, and it was funded for $125,000. Then a few years later, it continued through that pipeline and came back to NCRF for a final design and permitting proposal that was also funded for $985,000. So, thinking about how you follow that pipeline can open up some different opportunities. So this one is a great example of, working at scale. We've got almost 80 acres of in-water and nearshore habitat along the Lake Erie coastline. And we're hitting on so many different benefits here. Of course, first and foremost, we've got the resilience benefits. We're working to reduce coastal risks. We're working to help with flooding issues, all while also benefiting fish and wildlife, and also expanding parkland, enhancing recreation benefits, and improving critical community infrastructure. So this one works to protect 3,500 residents in underserved communities by building this project on the opposite side of I-90. So protecting, really, really critical community transportation infrastructure. Dan mentioned a few slides back how important partnerships are here. And this project I love because it's a great example of bringing in a lot of different partners at different levels of governance. So we've got Cleveland Metro Parks as the main applicant on this one, but we also have the County Port Authority. We've got the City of Cleveland, Ohio DNR, We've got the State Department of Transportation, Black environmental leaders, nonprofit. So we're working with a lot of different stakeholders and actors to bring one project together for funding. So that's one example. And here's another view of that, from the water looking landward. And a second example we wanted to bring in comes from Michigan. And this one was titled Reduce Storm-Related Impacts for Lake Superior Coastal Communities Through Habitat Restoration. So this one was funded in 2018, which was the first year of this program under NFWF. So I will note that the funding categories were a little bit different here. So the structure of how this project would come in for a proposal now has changed slightly, but what's competitive remains the same. So this one came in working to put on the ground 38 acres of coastal habitat along Lake Superior. Of course, working to reduce stormwater impacts while also, building up fish and wildlife habitat. This one touched on wetlands, upland habitat, dune and swale habitat, sand beach, all of that, and really working to reduce the impacts of wave action and flooding, and then also working to protect critical transportation infrastructure, restoring public access back down to the shoreline, and building up, again, that habitat for residents and wildlife. So you can see all of these different co-benefits or co-needs coming together, really finding that nexus in this funding program and moving forward. So, all of that will kind of give us a quick foundation of what this program funds, what's competitive, and what it really prioritizes. And we're, certainly happy to answer any questions after we wrap up here about the NCRF. But it's also important to consider how to connect this funding program and other grant funding programs to the broader idea of climate finance, right? More sustainable financing. There are certainly some benefits to approaching the funding piece and the financing piece together. So grants can be a great way to pilot some approaches that you might have that can be scaled up over time. So, bringing in grant funding for a smaller grant opportunity might be a great way to then move that forward by using financing, in the long term. Financing dollars can also be used to generate match for grants. So if you have an enterprise fund that's already set up in a community and, a grant program comes along that you'd like to apply for, pulling match dollars out of that fund can be a great way to show community investment. Financing also allows folks to, signal that commitment to making investment by having, climate programs in place, established and ready to go in your community, because that signifies that, you've gone through the process, you understand that, climate resilience is something that needs to be addressed, and the financing allows you to address that in a stable and a dedicated way, rather than taking dollars out of other community priorities. So there's obviously a lot more to this financing topic here. We just kind of wanted to put that out there and plant the seed for folks. But if there are any questions on that or any of the NCRF content that we've covered, we certainly encourage an email and would encourage folks to reach out. So I've included the Throwe environmental outreach email on this slide, so feel free to reach out to us directly there. And I've also included the name and email address for Aislinn Gaucher, who is the program director for the Great Lakes region for the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. So we'll leave those on screen for a minute, and I'll also ask Taylor if we can run a poll that we have to just poll folks on whether or not they like any engagement from our side after this webinar is over. So the first question asks whether you'd like follow-up on a specific project, and the second one asks if any of that follow-up might be related to environmental justice projects. So we'll leave this poll up for a few seconds. I will stop sharing these slides so we can have all of our presenters on screen. And we can probably jump right into questions in the next minute or so once folks finish up with these polls. It looks like these are all answered. So I'm going to close the poll in just a minute. Taylor, do you want to get us started with some questions?
Sure. I'll go with the first question, which is, will slides and/or recording be sent to the participants after the webinar? Kyle, I'll let you handle this one.
Yeah, so you might have seen on the slides, the recording will be up on our YouTube and the Throwe Environmental website. So that'll be readily available for folks. And we can definitely send it out directly to you after this webinar. I can either do that, through Throwe Environmental, or Amy, if you think it might be more effective if you through TNC takes care of that, that's fine either way. We'll leave that up to you.
The next question is just wanting you guys to potentially speak more about nature-based solutions, since the 2 projects shown involve a lot of big blocks and concrete.
Yeah, so I can speak to that one. So those might have taken a little bit more of a hybrid approach, but there were, critical nature-based functions going on there with, the living shoreline and creating all that native habitat. That being said, we're thinking at scale. So those projects were really highlighted because of the scale that they were working at, the projects that the different partners that they were bringing in, and all of the, the benefits that they touched on. So when we think about nature-based solutions, though, whether that's through an actual, nature-based solution itself or something that's mimicking that, we of course just want to be working with, whatever natural components that we can be. Dan or Taylor, do you have anything else to add on that?
No, that's right. And and I apologize if I sounded as if I was speaking in absolutes. Clearly, especially when you're working in urban environments, that the hybrid approach, as Kyle suggested, is going to be essential. So I guess the best advice we can give you is if there's some concern or questions about how this particular project or project you are considering would fit under this category, to reach out to us or NFWF, and we can kind of talk you through it. So again, I recognize that it's not completely absolute, but certainly you're trying to err on the side of nature-based and fish and wildlife-based action.
So it doesn't look like we have any other open questions. If you guys wanted to elaborate on anything else of no, oh, here we go. Yeah. Do you have information on when notice of funding opportunity will be released? And will NFWF request a pre-proposal, then full proposal if requested?
Yeah, so I can jump in on that. The RFP, as of right now, is likely to come out in, I think, late March. And there is a pre-proposal stage, so that's about 2 pages in length. And usually that's due, I think, in April or May. And then the full proposal ends up being something that's due in June, and that's obviously a little bit longer. So we don't have exact dates on that. That hasn't been released yet. If you're interested in seeing the timeline, though, I would direct you back to last year's RFP, which is available on the NCRF website, which I can post in the chat.
So since I will wait a minute to see if there are any other open questions. If you guys want to.
Okay, well, it looks like Heather Elmer posted one in the chat.
Oh,
asking about if a project incorporates gray infrastructure with nature-based solutions and gray components eligible for grant funds, or do they need to be supported with other funding? Like living shorelines of both rocks and plants. Will NFWF only pay for one portion of that, or the whole enchilada?
Yeah, if the answer is NFWF almost certainly would pay for the whole thing if as Kyle said, it was a hybrid approach that was actually mimicking natural systems. And so again, I think the best thing, first of all, this is also very related to the last question about pre-proposal and full proposal. As you're doing the pre-proposal, that's a good time to be reaching out to NFWF and saying, this is what we're considering. and explaining it in detail, and trying to get an understanding in that particular part of the process about how it would fit. So it would be very unusual. I've not heard through this fund and that NFWF would separate out the different parts of it and pay for part and ask for somebody else to pay the other part. Again, if it's a hybrid approach, but it's mimicking the natural system and meant to influence that natural system, then I think it will be received okay. But again, just the best thing to do is to have the conversation with Aislinn and others within NFWF in the Great Lakes region about what would work, whether or not it would be accepted.
Thanks, Dan. We have another question. Within an urban underserved community, how about community scale green infrastructure?
Yeah, but it depends again, the connective tissue is how that fits with the broader resilience need within that particular community. So when we say community scale, we're assuming that that's also defining the problem that the community is facing, and then that this particular project would be addressing that problem. Often what we see with community scale green infrastructure is that it's actually a combination of a number of disaggregated projects from around a community, which is actually quite common, obviously, in an urban setting. The most important part of it, though, is that we've seen a lot of urban proposals come in that are kind of positioned as community scale green infrastructure, but they're really water quality based stormwater programs. That is not going to compete well. This is not a water quality program. However, there are obviously multiple benefits with some of these multiple ecosystem service benefits, and we're really looking at those urban projects that would have a flooding or a resilience benefit. So they can be disaggregated and aggregate into a community scale project as long as it's all those conditions are being met as part of a broader planning initiative. It is actually meeting the need, or the scale is somehow commensurate with the need that is meant to address, and then it has a resilience component to it, not just a water quality component.
The next question is, in past cycles, NFWF has requested a 1-to-1 or 50% match. Will that match requirement be maintained for the infrastructure funding?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I guess the guidance that we've heard from NFWF so far without having an RFP in place is to not let any considerations of match prevent you from, thinking through a project idea and moving forward to apply at this time. Nothing's set in stone yet. That's, we don't have any more information on that, but we have been hearing, that they're thinking through the match topic, and to not let that stop you from moving forward at this time. What they really want to have you think about is that connection between resilience and fish and wildlife.
Yeah, so it's an issue that's in flux. And as Kyle said, we don't have more information, but we have heard that there will be some changes, but almost certainly those changes are going to would probably be in the direction of, as Kyle said, don't let the match get in the way. And I know it's hard to go out and do the fundraising for match with that type of ambiguous language, but that's what we know so far. But when the full proposal comes out, it'll just be much clearer at that point.
So the next question is, does this program pay for purchase of land?
I believe that's a no.
It's a no.
Dan and Taylor, yeah.
It's a no. But the purchase of land, back to the previous question, if done the right way, can be a very effective match if the funding is coming from somewhere else. And I know that if there's an organization out there that understands that better than anybody, it would be the Nature Conservancy. So no, you can't use it to purchase, but you could use it in combination with another funding opportunity to do that.
Should probably put this in the Q&A, but since I can, I'm just going to come off mute and ask my question. I think given the geographic scope, including the entire watersheds, but also the focus on coastal, how would projects be considered that are maybe, more upstream floodplain, flood control types of projects that would ultimately have a coastal resilience impact, but maybe are a little further removed? How's NFWF looking at those kinds of solutions in this?
I think they're pretty strict on as we said, they're going to be HUC 8 watersheds that are in the coastal zone. So that was that orange zone, Amy, that you saw on that map that I showed of Ohio. Or they're going to be HUC 8 watersheds that are tidally influenced. So they may be outside that zone, but they're tidally influenced. If they're not tidally influenced, I think it's kind of a hard cutoff. It's not going to get considered. That said, it's certainly, it may be worth a conversation with them if you had a project that it was, and I know this is classic water quality watershed restoration approach, which is focus upstream to benefit downstream and actually connect the two with restoration activity. It's possible that you could strengthen your project within the coastal zone if you are addressing the problem that's impacting that coastal zone from a resilience point of view. Again, it's not, if you're reducing nitrates, phosphorus, and sediment, that's probably very, very necessary, but it's not going to win you any points. And so it'd have to be a really strong connection between the two. And so I would hesitate. I would suggest it be an uphill battle or downhill battle, as the case may be. But I guess it's not out of the realm of possibility, but it's a long shot.
One other thing I'd like to bring up, I don't think we mentioned, and this is kind of particular to the Great Lakes, but yes, this is a coastal resilience fund and we talk about sea level rise, but we should also consider lake level change in the Great Lakes. So I don't think we explicitly said that, but I know we've been hearing that in the Great Lakes. NFWF recognizes as part of this program that you'll be dealing with issues from lake level rise and low lake levels, especially recently. I think there have been some historic lows in the area. So thinking about that and tying that back to, flooding, erosion, all of those other coastal, hazards are what will, resonate in this fund.
And we've also seen some strong proposals that incorporated invasive species. And we haven't seen anywhere that was the primary focus, but it's been a secondary focus and they've been well received. So as long as that issue of invasive species is a resilience problem, then you may want to consider that too.
Yeah, and that one will come, really down to framing how you're putting together this proposal, because you could be applying for a completely different fund and, place that invasive piece front and center. With this one though, having resilience as number one, and then like Dan said, supplementing with invasives, recreation, whatever else there might be, that'll do it.
And we just also want to point out that one of the things that so NFWF actually made it clear that the Great Lakes, including Ohio, were a priority, and they really wanted to make sure our outreach efforts focused on that region. But one of the things that is uniquely important about Ohio is the effort to the restoration effort that's going on, specifically as it impacts the Great Lakes and Lake Erie. And I know that a lot of that has been nutrient-based and phosphorus-based, but a lot of the activity that has been around that with the H2 Ohio program and other initiatives has been focused on the actual ecosystem itself, which is often wetlands and restoration of those aquatic habitat. So I know that that's been primarily a water quality play, but there are also obviously real resilience benefits, especially if those wetland restoration activity is happening in more urban areas and there's community around that would be impacted in that way. So we know that this is kind of a balance, that this is a very water quality focused region because of Lake Erie and the impact of phosphorus emissions and algal blooms. But if there is a way to couple, to continue to move your plan forward to get more wetlands in place and peel off some of that to be focused on the climate part of that, it would be to your benefit. And that's one of the things that interests us about the state of Ohio.
Well, it looks like we don't have any more open questions. So Kyle, if you want to wrap everything up. Oh, we have one more. Is it correct that the Ellie Islands are omitted from the project area?
I'm not familiar with the
Lake Erie.
Lake Erie.
Thank you.
Okay. I would have to look at the map. I'm not sure offhand. I did put the link to the map in the chat. I can repost it so it's the last thing that you have, but I am not sure offhand. I will say though that this, the resource for the NCRF footprint is what the program staff use to determine, whether or not a specific location is within this geographic boundary. So you're using, the same tool that they would be. All right, so with that, I'm not seeing any other questions. While we wrap up, we'll just give folks last call on that. Amy, if you have anything else.
Looking back at the map, the islands are actually not captured at all on that. So that would be an interesting question, maybe to see if NFWF would have some additional feedback. And
yeah, that can be something to follow up on. Taylor, maybe we can follow up and reach back out to Amanda who asked that question.
Yes, I will do that. Thanks, Amanda, for the question.
All right, well, if there are no other questions, thank you all for taking the time out of your afternoon to hear about this funding program. Like Dan mentioned, the Great Lakes as a whole, and Ohio more specifically, has been a priority area for some of our outreach. We want to see strong proposals coming out of the region. So we're really excited to follow up with anyone who's interested. I put our email in the chat, you saw it on the slides. And if you submitted that outreach poll, we'll be reaching out to you directly. So happy to do all of that. You will get the slides and a recording of this presentation in your email, and it will also be posted online. And other than that, just thank you all. And we look forward to being in touch on this opportunity.